October 24, 1944. Leyte Island, the Philippines. Somewhere inland from Red Beach. 6:19 a.m. The jungle smelled like rot and rain and the specific heaviness of air that has never fully dried. Air that carries moisture the way certain fabrics carry dye, completely and permanently, so that the moisture is not a quality of the air, but a condition of it. The thing the air is made of, rather than something added to it. The men of Baker Company, 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry Regiment, had been moving inland from Red Beach since the previous afternoon, moving through terrain that the briefing maps had described with contour lines and vegetation symbols that bore a relationship to the actual terrain, similar to the relationship between a description of a person and the person themselves, accurate in the broad outlines and insufficient in every detail that mattered for the work of moving through it. Private First Class. Henry Ito was 23 years old and had been an Army medic for 14 months. He was from Sacramento, California, the second son of a family that had operated a produce business on the east side of the city since 1921, and that had, in February of 1942, been given 72 hours to settle their affairs before being transported to the Manzanar War Relocation Center in the Owens Valley, where Henry and his parents, and his older brother James, and his younger sister Ruth, had spent the next 2 years in a tar paper barrack behind a barbed wire fence in the high desert, while the produce business that his father had built over 21 years was absorbed by circumstances that did not ask permission. He had volunteered for the Army in April of 1944, which was after the government had determined that Japanese-American men were acceptable for military service, a determination that arrived with the specific quality of a concession made by people who are not conceding anything they consider essential. He had passed the physical examination in Sacramento and been assigned to the Medical Corps, and trained at Camp Blanding in Florida, where the heat was different from the heat of the Central Valley, but was heat nonetheless, and where he had learned the things that Army medics learned about the body and its vulnerabilities and the specific procedures for addressing those vulnerabilities under field conditions, which were not the conditions of a hospital and were not the conditions of a training facility, but were the conditions of wherever the body happened to be when it required attention. His sergeant was a man named Franklin Cross, from Alabama, 31 years old, who had been in the Army since 1937 and who had the specific economy of motion and speech that comes from years of operating in environments where unnecessary motion and unnecessary speech are liabilities rather than habits. Cross had assessed Henry Ito on the first day of training with the directness of a man who had assessed many men in many conditions, and had developed a reliable methodology for the assessment, and had concluded after 3 days that Henry was the kind of man who did what he said he would do, which was the primary quality Cross looked for, because it was the quality that was most useful and most rare and most difficult to develop in someone who did not already have it. The men of Baker Company had landed on Red Beach on the afternoon of October 23rd as part of the broader Leyte operation, which was the operation that would determine whether the Philippines could be returned to the people who lived there from the people who had arrived in 1941 and stayed. The landing had been contested in the way that Pacific landings were contested, which meant that the men in the boats knew what they were moving toward before they arrived and moved toward it anyway, which was a form of commitment that required something that training approximated but could not fully produce, something that was only available in the moment of the thing itself. Henry had moved with the company from the beach inland through the afternoon and into the evening, moving through the jungle on paths that the advance elements had established, and that the maps had suggested existed, and that were, in practice, not paths in the sense of cleared ground, but paths in the sense of directions, through vegetation that had not yet fully closed behind the men who had gone through them first. The vegetation closed. The light failed. The company made camp in a clearing that was not quite large enough for the company, and was large enough for nothing else, and ate from cans that had been in their packs since the ship, and tried to sleep in the specific way of men who are too tired not to try, and too aware of their surroundings to succeed completely. Henry slept in increments. Between the increments he lay on the ground and listened to the jungle, which produced sounds that the briefing materials had described, and that were, in the actual hearing of them, more various and more continuous than the description had suggested. The jungle at night was not quiet in the way that darkness suggested quiet. It was loud with the specific loudness of a place that operates on a different schedule than the men moving through it. A loudness that was not threatening in itself, but that was continuous enough to prevent the kind of sleep that restores, rather than merely interrupts, the wakefulness. At 4:30 in the morning, he gave up on sleeping and sat with his back against a tree and checked his medical kit in the dark, the way he had checked it every morning since Camp Blanding, by feel rather than sight, each item in its specific location. The locations memorized to the point where the memory was in the hands rather than in the mind, available without the mind being required to retrieve it. Morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, battle dressings in 2 sizes, plasma, tourniquets, the items that the body would require if the day produced what the previous day had suggested the day would produce. Cross came by at 5:15 and looked at him sitting against the tree and said, "You sleep." Henry said, "Some." Cross said, "Enough." Henry said, "Enough to function." Cross looked at him for a moment with the assessment expression that Henry had learned to recognize and said, "Stay close to the front element today. We are going to move through a valley, and I want you where you can reach people fast if you need to reach them fast." Henry said he understood. Cross moved on. The company began moving at 6 o'clock. Henry moved with the front element, as Cross had said, 6 men, including himself, ahead of the main body, moving through the jungle on the path that was not quite a path, the vegetation wet from the night's rain, and producing the specific sound of wet vegetation against clothing and equipment. That was the sound of the morning in the jungle, continuous and close, and smelling like the rot and the rain and the particular combination of soil and plant matter. That was the smell of the ground, when the ground has been rained on continuously for long enough that the drying has stopped being a process, and the wetness has become the condition. The valley opened at 6:19. It was not a valley in the sense of a gradual geological feature. It was a break in the jungle, an area where the vegetation had been cleared or had been cleared by whatever had passed through it before Baker Company. An area of approximately 300 yards wide and perhaps 400 yards long, bordered on the far side by a ridge that the maps had labeled as a terrain feature, and that the reality revealed as a terrain feature with a specific quality that the maps had not conveyed, which was that it was occupied. The ridge was occupied in the way that prepared defensive positions are occupied, which means invisibly until the moment they choose not to be invisible, and that moment arrived at 6:22. The fire came from 3 positions on the ridge simultaneously, which meant it had been coordinated, which meant the positions had been watching the approach and had waited for the moment of maximum exposure, which was the moment when the front element was in the valley, with the jungle behind them and the ridge in front of them, and the open ground of the valley offering nothing between the two. Henry understood the geometry in the first second of the fire, the way he understood the location of each item in his medical kit, not through reasoning, but through the accumulation of training and the specific clarity that certain moments produce, in which the understanding arrives complete rather than in sequence. He was on the ground before the first second was finished. Not a decision exactly, but a response. The body doing what the body does when the training has been sufficient to move faster than the mind. The ground was wet and smelled like all the other ground in the jungle, and was solid underneath the wetness in the way of ground that has not been disturbed. And he pressed himself against it and assessed. 2 men from the front element were down. He could see them from where he was, both within 30 yards of his position. The first was a man named Garcia from Texas, who was not moving. The second was a man named Webb from Illinois, who was moving, which meant Webb was alive, and the movement meant something about where the injury was and how urgent the urgency was. The fire from the ridge was sustained and coming from positions that were not yet fully located, which meant moving toward either man would require moving across ground that was being watched from locations that had not all been identified. Cross was somewhere behind him. Henry could hear the company establishing positions at the jungle edge, the specific sounds of men taking cover and orienting weapons toward the source of fire, the sounds of the company becoming something other than a column in a jungle and becoming the thing it was trained to be when a column in a jungle encountered what this valley contained. This would take time. The time it would take was not time that Webb had in the quantity that the process required. Henry assessed the ground between himself and Webb. 22 yards. The ground was open with a slight depression running through it, a natural drainage channel that the rains had cut through the valley floor, shallow enough that it would not provide cover for a man crawling through it, but shallow enough to suggest that cover was theoretically possible, if the angle of the fire from the ridge was what Henry thought it was. He looked at the ridge and identified 2 of the 3 positions by the smoke of their firing, and calculated the angle and confirmed that the depression would reduce his exposure for approximately 15 of the 22 yards. He moved at 6:24. Not the full run that open ground suggested as the fastest approach, but the low crawl that the depression required and that training had produced as a specific muscle memory, available, without the muscle needing to ask the mind about it. The ground was wet and smelling and close, and he moved through it with the medical kit on his back and the specific focus of a man who has reduced the situation to the distance remaining and the ground under his hands and the sounds from the ridge that told him what the ridge was doing while he moved. Webb was hit in the right leg above the knee, a wound that Henry assessed in the first 10 seconds of reaching him, his hands doing the assessment, while his eyes remained on the ridge, the 2 processes running simultaneously in the way that 14 months of training had made them capable of running simultaneously. The wound was serious in the way that wounds above the knee are serious, which is that the anatomy of the location contains vessels that do not tolerate significant delay in the way that other locations tolerate delay, that the delay which is acceptable in other circumstances is not acceptable here. He applied the tourniquet with the efficiency that the efficiency was for, which was for exactly this: for a man on wet ground in a valley with fire coming from a ridge, and another man whose leg was doing what Webb's leg was doing. Webb said, "Garcia." Henry said, "I see him." Webb said, "He went down first." Henry said, "I know." He finished the tourniquet. He looked at Garcia. Garcia was 23 yards away in a different direction from the depression, which meant approaching Garcia required a different calculation than approaching Webb had required. He looked at the ridge positions he had identified, and the angle they covered, and the ground between himself and Garcia, and made the calculation with the part of his mind that made calculations, the part that had been running continuously since 6:22, and that was providing outputs that the rest of him was using without stopping to examine how the outputs had been produced. He reached Garcia at 6:31. Garcia was breathing, which was the first and most important information, and the breathing was labored in the specific way that suggested the location of the injury, before Henry's hands confirmed it, which was the chest, the right side, the specific location that produced the specific breathing that Garcia was producing, and that required the specific intervention that Henry's hands were already preparing for, while his mind was still completing the identification of the injury. Sucking chest wound. The intervention was the occlusive dressing from the kit, applied with the pressure and the angle that training had specified, and that Henry had practiced on training dummies at Camp Blanding in the Florida heat, and was now applying on Garcia on wet ground in a valley in the Philippines, while the fire from the ridge continued, and the company at the jungle edge continued doing what the company was doing, and the morning continued being what October mornings in the Philippines were, which was hot and wet and loud with everything that the morning was made of. Garcia said something in Spanish that Henry did not fully understand, but understood enough. He said, "You are going to be all right." He did not know if this was true. It was what he said, because it was what the situation required him to say, and the requirement was not a deception, but a specific form of care, the form that addresses the mind of the injured man, while the hands address the body, both being necessary and neither being sufficient alone. He stayed with Garcia for 4 minutes. The 4 minutes were the 4 minutes the intervention required, and not a minute less, and not a minute more, because more minutes than the intervention required were minutes spent in the open, in a valley, while the ridge produced fire. And the accounting of minutes was one of the things that the training had been for, the calibration of how long each action takes, and what can be done in the time it takes, and what cannot be done, and what the difference between those two categories costs. At 6:35, he heard a sound from the jungle edge that was not the sound of the company establishing positions. It was the sound of something going wrong with the company establishing positions, the specific change in the sound that Cross would have heard and acted on, and that Henry heard and understood, to mean that the situation in the valley had developed a dimension that the situation had not had at 6:19 when the valley had opened and the fire had started. The sound told him that there were men at the jungle edge who required what he had been providing to Webb and Garcia, men in the position that the company was now in that was different from the position it had been in. He looked at Garcia. Garcia was stable, in the relative sense that the intervention had addressed the immediate threat, and that the threat had moved from the category of immediate to the category of serious, which was a different category, with different implications for what the next minutes required. He looked at Webb, who was 23 yards away, and who had received the intervention that Webb required, and who was also in the category of serious rather than immediate. He looked at the jungle edge. He moved at 6:37. The movement back across the valley was the movement that the previous movements had been preparation for, not in the sense that he had planned it, but in the sense that the previous movements had produced the specific information about the ground and the angles and the depression that made the current movement possible in the way it was possible, rather than in some other way. He moved through the depression in the way he had moved through it before, and reached the jungle edge in what the watch on his wrist said was 4 minutes, and what felt like a duration that the watch did not have a unit for, the specific stretching of time that certain conditions produce. At the jungle edge, he found Cross. Cross was hit in the left arm, a wound that was not immediately life-threatening, but that was producing blood at a rate that made not immediately a phrase requiring careful interpretation. Cross was on his feet, which was the first information, and was directing the company's response to whatever had developed at the jungle edge while Henry had been in the valley, which was the second information, and both pieces of information told Henry something about the category of the wound and the category of the man. Henry dressed Cross's arm without being asked, and Cross allowed it, without stopping the direction of the company, the two of them operating in the specific coordination of men who have developed, through the months of the same company, the ability to function in parallel without requiring the parallel to be negotiated. Cross said, while Henry worked, "Two men down at the left flank, Henderson and Kowalski. Henderson is moving. Kowalski is not." Henry said, "I will go." Cross said, "The left flank is getting fire from the secondary position on the ridge, which we have not located yet." Henry said, "I understand." Cross said, "Ito." Henry looked at him. Cross said, "Come back." Henry said, "I intend to." He found Henderson first because Henderson was closer and because Henderson was moving, which told him something about Henderson that it did not tell him about Kowalski. Henderson had taken a round through the left shoulder that had exited cleanly in the way that certain rounds exit, which is in a way that is better than the alternative without being good. He was sitting against a tree at the left edge of the jungle with the specific expression of a man who has been shot and is processing the information. Henry dressed the wound and told Henderson to stay against the tree and not move from the tree, and that he was coming back. Henderson said, "Kowalski." Henry said, "I know." Kowalski was 30 yards further into the left flank, in a position that was further from the company's established line and closer to the secondary position on the ridge that Cross had said had not been located yet. The 30 yards were 30 yards through jungle rather than 30 yards across open ground, which meant they were slower than 30 yards of open ground, but offered a different kind of cover, the kind that the jungle provided, which was the cover of vegetation that stopped vision more reliably than it stopped projectiles, but that was better than the alternative of open ground. He reached Kowalski at 7:04. Kowalski was a man from Minnesota who had been in Baker Company since before Henry joined it, and who had, in the months of Henry's time in the company, been the kind of man whose presence in a unit functions as a form of ballast, the person whose steadiness provides reference for everyone else's steadiness, whose reliability generates reliability in the people around him, the way certain physical conditions generate the conditions that sustain them. He was hit in the abdomen, which Henry assessed before he assessed anything else, and which told him what the assessment was going to tell him before it finished telling him. Abdominal wounds in the field in 1944 were a category of injury that the training addressed with the specific vocabulary of triage, which was the vocabulary of what was possible and what was not possible, given the resources available and the time available, and the distance to the nearest facility that could address what the field could not address. Henry applied the dressings and the intervention that the intervention called for, and worked with the efficiency that the efficiency was for. And while he worked, he talked to Kowalski in the way he had talked to Garcia, the form of care that addresses the mind while the hands address the body. Kowalski was conscious, and his eyes were on Henry's face with the attention of a man who is reading the face for information that the face is being asked to provide in a specific way. Kowalski said, "How bad?" Henry said, "I am working on it." Kowalski said, "Ito." He said it the way Cross had said it at the jungle edge, the way of a man who is asking a question by saying a name, the question being the question that the name contains, which is the question that neither of them was going to say directly. Henry looked at him. He said, "I am not going to leave you here." Kowalski said, "That is not what I asked." Henry said, "I know what you asked." He finished the dressing. He looked at the jungle around them and at the direction of the company, and at the 30 yards of jungle between their current position and the position where Henderson was against the tree, and the position beyond that where the company line was. He said, "I need you to help me with this next part." Kowalski said, "Tell me what to do." Henry said, "I am going to move you, and it is going to hurt, and I need you to stay conscious while it hurts." Kowalski said, "I can do that." Henry said, "I know you can." The movement of a man with an abdominal wound through 30 yards of jungle is a specific kind of work that the training describes, and that the description does not fully capture, the way the description of the jungle did not capture the jungle, the way the contour lines did not capture the valley. Henry moved Kowalski through the 30 yards with the efficiency that he had available, and the care that the injury required, and the speed that the situation demanded. The three of them in tension with each other in the way that the requirements of a thing are often in tension with each other, and that the resolution of the tension is the work itself, is what the doing of the thing consists of. Henderson was where he had left him, against the tree, which was what he had told Henderson and what Henderson had done. Henry moved them both back toward the company line, Kowalski with Henry's support, and Henderson under his own movement, and they reached the company line at 7:19. He delivered them to the position where Cross had established the company's medical point and assessed 2 more men who had been hit in the interval since he had left for the left flank. The assessment and intervention of the 2 men taking 11 minutes of the specific focused work that the 11 minutes were for. And at 7:30, he looked up from the second man, and Cross was beside him. Cross said, "There are 2 more in the valley." Henry said, "I know." Cross said, "The company has identified the secondary position. We are working on suppression." He paused. "The valley is not safe?" Henry said, "The valley was not safe at 6:22 either." Cross looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Take Morrison with you." Morrison was a rifleman who had been in the company since the beginning and who had the specific quality of a man who moves well in bad conditions, which was the quality that the current conditions required in a person who was going to accompany Henry back into the valley. Henry said, "Tell Morrison I am leaving in 2 minutes." He left in 2 minutes. Morrison was beside him, and they moved across the valley in the way that 2 men move, when one of them knows the ground and the other knows how to cover a man who knows the ground, which is a specific form of coordination that does not require discussion, because the roles are clear and the discussion would take time that the ground does not permit. Webb was where Henry had left him, which was the information that the tourniquet and the intervention had been for, that Webb would be where Henry had left him when Henry came back. He was conscious, and the leg was doing what the tourniquet was designed to make the leg do, which was not what the leg would do without the tourniquet, which was the point. Henry checked the tourniquet and checked Webb and told him what was happening, and Webb said, "Garcia." Henry said, "Next." Webb said, "Go." Henry went. Garcia was also where Henry had left him, which was the information that the occlusive dressing and the intervention and the 4 minutes had been for. The breathing was different from the breathing at 6:31, which told Henry something that he confirmed with his hands, and that confirmed what the breathing had told him, which was that Garcia was in the category that had changed since 6:31. The category that the distance to the nearest surgical facility and the time that distance required and the nature of the injury were all factors in the category that triage described with the vocabulary of what was possible and what the field could provide and what the field could not provide. He worked for 8 minutes. Morrison maintained position and watched the ridge and said nothing. The 8 minutes were the 8 minutes that the work required, and Henry did not account for the 8 minutes while he was in them, because accounting for them was not the work, and the work was what was available to be done, which was not everything that Garcia required, but was what was possible in a valley in the Philippines on the morning of October 24th, 1944, with the ridge producing fire and the distance to the nearest surgical facility being what it was. At 7:41, he and Morrison moved Garcia and Webb back toward the company line. Garcia required carrying. Webb required support. Morrison carried Garcia with the specific capability of a man who has been moving things through difficult terrain for the years that Morrison had been moving things through difficult terrain. And Henry supported Webb, and they moved across the valley floor in the specific way of people who are doing something difficult and are doing it with everything they have, because everything they have is what the thing requires, and there is no option of doing it with less. They reached the company line at 7:53. Henry delivered Garcia and Webb to the medical point and knelt beside Garcia and checked the dressing and the breathing and the other things that needed to be checked, and found what he found, and stayed with Garcia for a moment in the way of a man who has done what was possible and is present with what the possible was and what it was not. Cross came and stood beside him. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "The secondary position has been silenced. The valley is clear." Henry nodded. Cross said, "You went into that valley 4 times. Henry said, 3 times. 2 approaches, and 1 return. Cross said, 3 times then. He paused. I counted 4. Henry said, "The last one was with Morrison." Cross said, "It was still you." Henry said nothing. The company reorganized at 8:15 and began moving again at 8:45, moving through the valley and up toward the ridge and past the ridge into the terrain beyond it, moving in the direction that the operation required them to move, which was the direction that the beach and the ships and the planning that preceded the ships and the broad shape of the war's current state all pointed toward. Henry moved with them. He checked his medical kit at 8:30 in the interval between the reorganization and the movement by feel rather than sight, the way he always checked it, each item in its specific location, noting what had been used and what remained, and what the distance to the next resupply was likely to mean for the ratio between the two. Morphine syrettes reduced, sulfa powder reduced, battle dressings significantly reduced, plasma 1 unit remaining, tourniquets 2 remaining. He noted the inventory with the specific neutrality of a man taking inventory, which is a form of assessment that does not editorialize about what the inventory contains, but simply records it, because the recording is what is useful, and editorializing is not. The terrain beyond the ridge was different from the terrain of the valley, in the way that terrain in the Pacific changed over short distances. The jungle dense, and then not dense, and then dense again. The ground rising and then flattening and then rising. The path that was not quite a path continuing in the direction that the maps suggested, and that the actual terrain confirmed in the broad outline and contradicted in the details. Henry moved through it with the company, which was now 26 men, where it had been 31 at the beach. The 5 who were not present accounted for in the medical point, behind them, and in the valley, and in the ground of the valley where one of the 5 remained. Cross moved beside him for part of the morning. The arm dressing was holding. Cross moved with the efficiency he always moved with, the left arm in a sling that Henry had fashioned, and that Cross wore with the specific expression of a man who has accepted a necessary constraint without accepting that the constraint changes anything essential about how he operates. They did not discuss the valley. The valley was something they both carried in the way that Cross had said in training, that men carry the things that happen, which is not in the hands where carrying is visible, but in the body, where it is not visible but is present, and continues to be present, and becomes over time one of the weights that the body moves with rather than against. At noon they stopped in a clearing for 30 minutes and ate, and Henry checked the men who had been hit that morning and were still moving with the company, which was 3 of the 5, 2 having been evacuated from the medical point to the beach, and then to the ships. The 3 who were still moving were moving with the specific determination of men who have made a decision about what moving requires that takes precedence over what their bodies are saying about what moving costs. He dressed the wounds that the movement had disturbed and told each man what he was seeing and what it meant for the next several hours, and what the next several hours could not include if the next several hours were going to produce what came after them. Henderson said, while Henry was dressing his shoulder, "I did not know medics went into fire like that." Henry said, "We go where the men are." Henderson said, "But you went 3 times." Henry said, "The men were there 3 times." Henderson looked at him. He said, "Ito." Henry looked at him. Henderson said, "Thank you." Not the reflexive thank you. The thank you that means a specific thing and takes a moment to say it clearly enough that the specific thing comes through. Henry looked at him for a moment and nodded once and moved to the next man. The afternoon brought different terrain and different challenges, and 2 more incidents that required Henry's specific attention, neither as complex as the morning, but both requiring the efficiency and the care and the calibration of what the time permitted. The 2 forms of his work running simultaneously, the way they always ran, the hands addressing the body and the voice, and the eyes addressing the mind of the man whose body the hands were addressing. By the time the company stopped for the evening, he had used everything in the kit that could be used and had rationed what remained, with the specificity of a man who knows what tomorrow is likely to require and is preparing for it with what today has left him. Cross organized the camp perimeter with the efficiency that Cross organized things. Henry set up the medical point at the center of the perimeter in the position that offered the most access from all directions and the most protection from the directions that the perimeter covered. He organized what remained of the supplies in the specific order that the order was for, each item where his hands knew to find it, the organization being both practical and something else, a form of readiness that was also a form of the particular attention he brought to the work, the attention that had been present since the first morning at Camp Blanding, when he had learned what the work was. At 9 o'clock in the evening, Cross came to the medical point and sat down, and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am putting you in for a commendation." Henry said, "That is not necessary." Cross said, "It is not about necessary." Henry said, "I was doing my job." Cross looked at him with the assessment expression. He said, "Ito, doing your job and what you did today are related, but they are not the same thing." Henry said nothing. Cross said, "Garcia." Henry said, "I know." Cross said, "You gave him the best chance he had." Henry said, "It was not enough." Cross said, "It was what was possible." The difference between those 2 things is not on you. It is on the valley and the ridge and the distance to the ships. He paused. "You understand that?" Henry said, "I understand it." Cross said, "Understanding it and carrying it are different things." Henry looked at him. Cross said, "You are going to carry it for a long time? That is also part of the job? Not the part they tell you about in training, but the part that is there." They were quiet for a moment. The jungle produced its continuous sound around the perimeter, the sound of the night in a place that does not change its operations for the presence of men with intentions that the jungle has no framework for. Henry listened to it the way he had listened to it the previous night, with the part of him that was not required for sleep, which was most of him. Cross said, "Webb is going to keep the leg." Henry said, "I know. The tourniquet was right." Cross said, "It was." He stood. He said, "Get some sleep." Henry said, "Some." Cross said, "Enough." Henry said, "Enough to function." Cross looked at him for a moment with the expression that was not quite the assessment expression, and not quite something else, but was between them and had in it the specific quality of one man looking at another man after a day that has been the kind of day the day had been. Then he walked back to the perimeter. Henry sat at the medical point and checked the kit again in the dark, by feel, each item in its specific location. He sat with what remained of the inventory, and with what the day had cost, and what the day had made possible, and the specific accounting of those two things, which did not balance in the way that accounting usually balances, and which was not the kind of accounting that was supposed to balance. He sat with Garcia, which was not something he could stop doing, and was not something he was trying to stop doing, because stopping would have required something he did not have and had not been trained to develop, and that he was not certain was a quality he would want to develop. He thought about Manzanar. He thought about the barrack in the high desert and the barbed wire fence and the 72 hours that his family had been given to settle their affairs, and the produce business that the 72 hours had not been sufficient to settle, and that had not been there to return to. He thought about his brother James, who had also volunteered, who was in Italy with the 442nd, the regiment of men from the same camps and the same 72 hours, and the same barbed wire fence who were doing in Italy what Henry was doing in the Philippines, which was the thing that they had been told they were not suited for, and had then been asked to do when the arithmetic of the war required it, and had done. He thought about Sacramento and the produce business, and the specific smell of the East Side Market in the early morning when the deliveries came in, the smell of vegetables and earth, and the cold of early morning in the Central Valley. He thought about his mother in the barrack, doing what his mother did in the barrack, which was what she had always done, which was to make the space available habitable through the specific attention she brought to it, the attention that did not require the circumstances to be different than they were, but that worked with what the circumstances provided and produced from that, something that was not the barrack but was a kind of home. Despite the barrack, the way a medic in a valley in the Philippines worked with what the valley provided and produced from that, what was possible even when the possible was not sufficient. He thought about Garcia. He let himself think about Garcia in the specific way of a man who has decided that thinking about Garcia is something he owes, that the not thinking would be a different kind of failure from the failure of the insufficient possible, a failure of acknowledgement rather than of action. Garcia had been 22 years old and from Texas and had talked about his family in the evenings, in the way of men who talk about their families when they talk about things that matter, which is the way you talk about something when you want the person you are talking to understand why the thing matters, rather than simply that it matters. He sat with it for the time that sitting with it required, which was the time he had in the interval between the end of the day and the beginning of whatever sleep was going to be available. Then he lay down on the ground that smelled like the ground, and listened to the jungle that sounded like the jungle, and waited for the sleep that came in increments and took what it could get. At 5:30 in the morning, he was up and checking the kit by feel in the dark before Cross came by at 5:45 and looked at him and said, "You sleep?" Henry said, "Some." Cross said, "Enough." Henry said, "Enough to function." Cross said, "All right." He looked at the kit and the inventory and the preparation that the preparation was. He said, "The company moves at 6. Henry said, "I will be with the front element." Cross said, "Yes." He moved on. The company moved at 6. Henry moved with the front element. The jungle closed around them the way the jungle closed, and the morning was what October mornings in the Philippines were. And the work continued in the way of work that continues because the thing that requires it continues. And the thing that requires it is the work itself, the men and the days and the terrain and the distance remaining, which was not on any map and could not be measured with the instruments available, and was simply the distance that remained between the current position and the position that the current position was moving toward, carried in the body the way the other things were carried, distributed, and present, and not in the hands. He moved through the morning with the company, and the company moved through the morning with itself, 31 men from the beach, now 26, and moving in the direction that 26 men who have been 31 move when they are the kind of men that Baker Company was, which is the direction that the thing they came to do requires, with the weight of what the distance has cost carried in the way that things carried in the body are carried, in the background of the motion, present in every step, and not the subject of any step, the way the things that matter most are present in every moment, and are not always the subject of the moment and are there nonetheless. This story is a work of original fiction, inspired by the experiences of soldiers and medics in the Pacific theater of World War II, including members of the Japanese-American community who served in the United States Army. Any resemblance to specific real persons is coincidental. The story is intended to honor the courage and sacrifice of all those who served. This video is made for educational and entertainment purposes. If this resonated with you, subscribe and leave a like. New video coming soon?